What would you do if everything you owned in this world fit inside one canvas bag, and the only thing left to your name was a rusted freight car that no living soul had managed to open in 39 years? For Nell Hadley, 19 years old and freshly turned out of the only home she had left, this was not a question. It was a Tuesday. The car itself sat at the far end of a weed-grown siding in the rail town of Pellin, Colorado, its doors fused shut with rust and its seams sealed with lead, and the men at the auction had laughed out loud when she raised a hand and bought it for $6. They called it a coffin on wheels. They called it a fool's $6. But the car had been sealed by a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and what waited inside it had been patient for 39 years, a secret that would not only remake one cast-off girl's life, but settle a debt the whole town had forgotten it owed. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. To understand what Nell Hadley saw in that dead freight car, you have to understand the man who taught her how to look at iron. Her father, Thomas Hadley, had been the blacksmith at the Pellin and Western Roundhouse for 22 years, and he had raised his daughter the way he worked steel, with patience, with heat, and with an absolute refusal to hurry anything that mattered. Nell's mother had died when she was 4, of a fever that came off the river bottoms in the wet spring of 1896, and after that it was just the two of them, a smith and his girl, in a 2-room company house that smelled of coal smoke and quench water and the sharp, clean reek of hot iron. Thomas did not believe in keeping children out of the work. By the time Nell was 8, she could pump the great bellows steady as a heartbeat. By 12, she could read a piece of bar stock the way other girls read novels. She could tell you, just from the color it took in the forge, whether it wanted to be struck or whether it wanted one more breath of heat. Her father had a saying, and he said it so often that it wore a groove in her mind: iron tells the truth, if you strike it gentle and listen for the ring. A sound bar sang. A flawed bar, one with a cold shut or a hidden crack, answered with a dull, dead note, no matter how pretty it looked on the outside. Men lie, he told her. Ledgers lie. But metal cannot lie, because metal doesn't know how. He taught her the whole quiet vocabulary of the trade. How to draw a taper. How to upset a bar to thicken it. How to drift a hole true through 2 inches of plate. How to temper a chisel so it would cut a rivet head without shattering. And when she was 15, he forged her a hammer of her own, a little crosspeen, 11 inches of hickory and 1.25 pounds of good tool steel, with her initials, NH, stamped into the cheek while it was still cherry red. It was the only thing he ever gave her that wasn't food or shelter, and she carried it everywhere, the way other young women carried a locket. She did not know, then, how soon that hammer would be all she had left of him. Thomas Hadley died in the spring of 1910, and he died the way men of his trade too often did, not in one dramatic moment, but in a slow surrender. A piece of slag had taken his left eye in 1908, and the cough he'd carried for years, the one that sounded like a rasp drawn across a file, finally turned to something worse that winter. He went quietly, on a Sunday, with Nell holding a hand that was still hard as horn from 40 years of hammering. He was 51 years old. The railroad paid out a death benefit of $30. The funeral took 22 of it. And that is when Nell Hadley learned that she had an uncle. Silas Brandt was her mother's brother, a freight clerk up in Cheyenne, a man who spoke in the grammar of ledgers and who had attended the funeral mostly, it seemed, to make sure no one buried anything of resale value with his brother-in-law. He took Nell back to Cheyenne with him. There was nowhere else for her to go, and for 1 year she lived in his narrow house over the freight office, and she learned what it means to be entered in someone's books as a liability. Silas never raised his voice. Cruelty like his doesn't need volume. He simply kept accounts. He noted, aloud and at the supper table, that her board came to $4 a week. That the coal she burned came to more. That a girl of 19 with no prospects was, as he phrased it, a diminishing asset in a household that ran on arithmetic. When his wife suggested Nell might hire on at the laundry, Silas said no, the wages wouldn't cover what she cost, and the optics, as he called them, were poor. The end came on the first Tuesday of May, 1911. Nell remembered the date because Silas made a ceremony of it, the way clerks do. He called her into the front room after supper. There was a desk and an oil lamp, and the household ledger open to a fresh page, and on the blotter, counted out with terrible precision, lay $11, one $5 note and 6 silver dollars, stacked in a column of 3 and a column of 3. Silas tapped the ledger once, with one finger. He told her that her father's account with the family was now settled, that there was no further obligation on either side, and that the $11 represented, as he put it, a final disbursement. He said the word disbursement the way other men say goodbye. He had already bought her a ticket, not out of kindness, but because, he explained, it was cheaper to send her somewhere than to feed her while she found her own way. There was a property matter in Pellin, he said, some unclaimed railroad salvage from her father's estate that the company wanted off its books, and she might as well sign for it, since she had a head for such things. He said that last part like a man settling a joke. Nell did not argue. She had learned long ago, watching her father cool steel, that some things cannot be bent once they have hardened, and arguing with them only breaks your tools. She went upstairs and packed one canvas bag, 2 dresses, her father's wool coat, cut down to fit her, a tin cup, a photograph of her parents, wrapped in a sock, and at the very bottom of the bag, wrapped in oiled cloth so it would not rust, the little crosspeen hammer with her initials in the cheek. She left in the morning. Silas did not come down to see her off. He had, she supposed, already closed the account. The journey south took 3 days and 240 miles, and Nell watched the country change through the streaked window of the coach like a woman watching her life rewind. Cheyenne's brick and gaslight gave way to the long bare benchland of the Front Range, and that gave way to country that grew lonelier by the hour, pinyon and bare rock, cattle thin as shadows, station towns that were little more than a water tower and a windmill and a man with a flag. It was early May, and the wind never stopped, and it carried the smell of dust and creosote and distance. Pellin, when she reached it, was a town the railroad had built and then half forgotten. The roundhouse still stood, and the coal dock, and 2 streets of false-fronted stores, but the silver strike over the divide had played out years before, and half the windows on Main Street were boarded. The land agent who met her at the depot was a sweaty young man named Purvis who seemed embarrassed on her behalf, as if her arrival were a clerical error he was obliged to process. The salvage matter, he explained, as they walked down past the roundhouse, concerned one item. At the end of the far siding, half sunk in weeds, on trucks so rusted they seemed to have grown into the rail, stood a freight car. It was not a big car. 34 feet, wooden-bodied, iron-strapped, its paint so long gone that the boards had silvered like driftwood. The number 412 was still faintly visible on the flank, and beneath it, half flaked away, a stenciled line of tear weight and a name, E. Crow, Agent. Both doors were shut, and around every seam, door, roofwalk, end sill, ran a rough grey bead that Nell recognized at once, because her father had used the same stuff on boiler patches. Lead. Someone had sealed that car, every seam of it, the way you seal something you never intend to open again. Purvis told her the story as if it were a warning. The car had come in on a way freight in 1872, consigned to the Pellin yard, and before anyone ever unloaded it, the man who'd shipped it, Crow, a railroad paymaster out of Denver, had been accused of stealing a payroll and had died before he could answer for it, and the car had sat unclaimed ever since. 39 years. Men had tried to open it, over the decades. The lock was like nothing anyone had seen. A yard crew had once taken a sledge and a bar to the door and given up after half a day. The company wanted it gone, the siding was needed, and so the car, and the 30 feet of rail it stood on, had been offered to Thomas Hadley's estate as the last scrap of salvage due him, and the estate, in the person of a freight clerk in Cheyenne, had declined to pay the transfer fee. So there would be an auction, Purvis said. Saturday. The car would go for whatever it would go for, probably to the scrappers from Pueblo, and he advised her, kindly, to take whatever the scrappers offered for her claim and buy a ticket back north. There's nothing in that car but bad luck, he said. 39 years of it. Nell walked once around the car, slowly, in the wind, with the weeds brushing her father's coat. She put her palm flat against the board wall, the way her father used to touch a forging to judge its heat. The men at the depot were watching her, and grinning. Let us know in the comments what you would have done, taken the ticket home, or stayed. She stayed. The auction on Saturday took 4 minutes. The scrappers from Pueblo bid $2 for the trucks and the iron strapping, and Nell, standing at the back in her father's cut-down coat, bid $6. It was every coin Silas Brandt had stacked on his blotter, minus the $5 note. The auctioneer looked at her the way you look at a person who has bet their dinner on a dead horse, and he said sold before anyone could reconsider, and the yard men laughed, not cruelly, exactly, but the way men laugh at whether they don't have to stand in. $6 for a coffin on wheels, one of them called out, and the line followed her up Main Street. She had the $5 note left, and she spent $3 of it on a week's board at Widow Penn's rooming house and the rest on nails, a saw file, a pry bar, and a tin of coal oil. On Sunday morning she walked down to the siding and began, and this is the part of the story where there is no magic at all, only work. The car sat on 30 feet of rail at the end of a dead siding, and the ground around it was a thicket of cheat grass and Russian thistle, and the wind came off the flats without mercy. Nell cleared the weeds by hand, because she had no scythe. She pulled the thistle barefisted until her palms bled, and then wrapped her hands in strips torn from an old dress and kept pulling. She shoveled out the drifted cinder and sand that had banked against the trucks, 1 bucket at a time, 40 buckets on the first day, and the yard men watched from the coal dock the way you'd watch weather. By the end of the first week, her hands had changed. The softness that 11 months in a clerk's house had put on them was gone, split open and grown back harder, and her fingers stopped aching at night and simply went still, the way her father's hands used to rest on the table after a long heat. She swept the roof walk clear of 39 years of grit. She brushed the rust scale off the couplers with a wire brush, stroke by stroke, until she could read the maker's marks. She was not trying to open the car. Not yet. She was doing what her father had taught her to do before any hard job. She was preparing the work, and she was listening. It was the widow, Cora Penn, who first helped her, though the word help is almost wrong, because nothing was ever said about it. A loaf of bread and a jar of preserves simply appeared on the crosstie beside the car one noon, and appeared again the next noon, and when Nell tried to thank her, Cora Penn, 60 years old, black dress, no patience for sentiment, said only that she did not bake for the car, she baked for the hands. A carpenter named Amos Bly, who kept the coffin shop 2 doors up from the rooming house, walked down one evening without a word and reset the leaning sill post of the siding's old tool shed, squared it, spiked it, and left, so she'd have a dry place for her tools. That was all. No speeches. Nell understood. Her father had been the same. In a working town, respect is a verb, and then there was Orrin Pike. Orrin Pike was 81 years old and had been everything a man could be in that country: trapper, freighter, powderman, and finally, for 30 years, the yard watchman, until the railroad pensioned him with a lamp and a chair by the coal dock. He sat there most days, wrapped in a coat older than Nell, and he watched her work. He was the only man in Pellin who did not laugh about the car. On the 9th day, as Nell came past with her bucket, Orrin Pike said the only thing he ever said to her about it, and he said it without being asked, in a voice like gravel settling. He said, "Rust is just iron remembering, girl. And that car's been remembering something heavy for a long time." Nell nodded politely and went on, and did not understand him at all. "Do you understand him yet? Hold on to that line. It comes back." The despair came in the second week, as despair does, not at the start, when you're angry, but later, when the work has worn the anger off and left only the facts. Her week at the rooming house was nearly up. Her money was gone. The car stood sealed and indifferent, its lead seams grey as scar tissue, and Nell sat on the sill in the evening wind and admitted to herself, for one bad hour, that the yard men were probably right. She had spent a dead man's $11 on 34 feet of rotting pine, and Silas Brandt, if he ever heard, would enter it in his ledger and smile. She almost wept. She did not. Her father had no use for tears near hot iron. He used to say, "Water and hot iron make steam, and steam blinds you." So she sat until the sun went down over the divide, and then she got up and did the only thing she knew how to do with despair, which was to put her hands on something and work. It was the next morning that she found the first clue, and she found it because of her hands, not her eyes. She was scrubbing the flaked paint off the car's flank with a wire brush, working down toward the sill, when the brush uncovered the tear stencil, the weight marking every freight car carries, so the scalesmen know what the empty car weighs and can subtract it from a load. She knew how to read it. Tear 24,000. 24,000 pounds, empty. 12 tons of pine and iron, which was right and proper for a car that size. And there was the thing. Because Nell Hadley had spent 9 days shoveling cinder out from under those trucks, and she had looked at them 100 times, and something in the deepest layer of her Smith's education had been quietly bothering her without ever rising to a thought. Now it rose. The car's springs, the great leaf clusters over the journals, were not standing easy, the way an empty car's springs stand. They were half-compressed, bowed, carrying weight. She had seen 100 loaded cars in her father's yard and 1,000 empties, and her eye knew the difference the way a nurse knows fever. The car said it weighed 12 tons, empty. Its springs said it was carrying a load. She stood there in the wind for a long moment, and the yard noise went thin and far away. "Iron tells the truth," her father's voice said, from 11 years back and 6 feet under. "If you strike it gentle, and listen for the ring. A sound car sings. She took out the little crosspeen hammer, unwrapped it from its oiled cloth, and began to walk the length of the car, striking the wallboards gently, panel by panel, the way her father had taught her to test a bar. The walls sang. Boards, air, the honest ring of an empty wooden box. Until she reached the far end of the car, the end away from the depot, the end that faced the divide. There, the hammer's note changed. No ring. A dull, dead, heavy thud, like striking a bar with a cold shut hidden inside it. The last 4 feet of that car did not sing, because the last 4 feet of that car were not empty. She struck it again. Dead. Again. Dead. Behind those boards, something 4 feet deep and 34 feet of car long had swallowed the hammer's voice. Nell stepped back, and her heart was going hard, and she remembered the dead note of a flawed bar, and her father's certainty that metal cannot lie because it doesn't know how. Somewhere in there was a wall that wasn't a wall. And between that wall and the true end of the car, 4 feet deep, lay whatever made a 24,000-pound empty car ride its springs like a loaded one. Now, she had the clue. But knowing there's a hidden room in a sealed car and getting into it are 2 very different things, and here's where I'd ask you, how do you open a door that has no lock on the outside, no keyhole, and 39 years of lead holding every seam? Tell me in the comments what you'd try first. What Nell tried first was the doors, because her father had a rule, never break what you can open. She studied the door seams for a full day before she touched them. The lead had been run in rough, by a man in a hurry, but the lock itself was another matter. There was a lock plate on the left door, a slab of half-inch steel with a single slot, and no maker's mark, and when Nell cleaned it with coal oil and a rag she found something that made her sit down on the crossties and think. The plate had been fitted from inside the car. The rivet heads were on the inside. Which meant the man who sealed the car had sealed it from within, and then had left it somehow, because no bones had ever been found in car 412, that much the whole town knew. She did not attack the lock. A lock you don't understand will outlast your tools, that was another of her father's rules. Instead, she did what a smith does, she went around the metal, not through it. The doors hung on strap hinges, and the hinges were through-bolted, and the bolts were rusted solid. But rust, her father used to say, is just iron that's let go of itself, and it holds worse than sound steel but cuts easier. She soaked the bolt shoulders in coal oil for 2 days. She filed a drift down to size, heated the hinge straps with a brazier she'd cobbled from an old oil drum, and worked the bolts back and forth, quarter turn by quarter turn, the way you coax a seized journal, heat, oil, patience, never force. It took her 3 days to free 8 bolts, and by the end of it her forearms were striped with burns and she had never once hurried. The hinges came off. The door still did not move, because of the lead. The lead was easy, once she thought about it as a smith instead of as a burglar. Lead runs at a low heat, 600 degrees, no more. She built a charcoal fire in the brazier, took her father's old soldering iron, which had been in the bottom of her bag all along under the hammer, and drew the seams the way you draw a temper, running the hot iron along the grey bead until it glistened and slumped and ran off in bright drops. The smell of it was sharp and metallic, and the yard men had stopped laughing by then, and 2 or 3 of them came down after their shifts and watched from a respectful distance, the way men watch any work they couldn't do themselves. On the 6th day, with the hinges off and the seams drawn, Nell set her pry bar in the door gap, and put her weight on it, and felt 39 years of stillness resist her, and then give, all at once, with a groan of old timber and a long exhale of dead air that smelled of cedar and machine oil and dust so old it had forgotten being dust. The door swung 4 inches and stopped against rust. It was enough. She put her eye to the gap, in the late afternoon light, and looked inside car 412. The interior was empty, swept clean, bare boards, bare ribs. Ordinary. But she already knew the truth of it, because the inside of the car was 30 feet long, and the outside was 34. 4 feet of the car were missing, hidden behind the wall at the far end, the wall that had answered her hammer with a dead, loaded thud. She widened the gap, slid through sideways, and stood inside with the light coming through the door crack in one slanted blade. Up close, the false end wall was obvious to a craftsperson's eye. The boards ran the wrong way, vertical, while every other board in the car ran horizontal, and the grain didn't match, and when she ran her palm across the join she felt a seam as fine as a knife cut. Whoever built this wall had been good. Better than good. The boards were tongue and groove cedar, fitted like cabinet work, and at its base, nearly invisible under 39 years of dust, she found a line of countersunk screws, slotted, brass, unrusted. Cedar. brass screws, cabinet joinery. A paymaster's idea of a wall, she thought, a man who worked with money and paper, who'd ordered a vault built the way he'd order furniture. An iron man would have riveted it. This man had screwed it shut, which meant, her breath caught, he had meant it to be opened again, by someone, someday, who took the time to look. She set the first screw with her saw file's point and backed it out with her knife and a square of leather for grip, one full turn at a time. 14 screws. When the 14th came free, the cedar panel sighed inward on its own weight, and Nell Hadley reached into the dark with both hands and pulled the false wall of car 412 away from the truth. You've waited long enough, here's what's behind that wall. But before we go in, if you're finding this story worth your evening, take one moment and subscribe. We tell stories like this every week, of the things people hide and the people patient enough to find them. The hidden compartment was 4 feet deep and ran the full width of the car, and the light from the door reached into it like a hand. Nell stood in the doorway of it for a long time before she moved. Later, she would tell Cora Penn that it was not the contents that stopped her. It was the order. Everything inside had been arranged, and a thing arranged is a thing meant, and she understood, standing there, that she was not the first person to stand in that spot. She was the second. There were 2 strong boxes, iron-strapped oak, each the size of a traveling trunk, painted black, stenciled with the letters P and W, Pellin and Western. There was a paymaster's field desk, a folding campaign desk of mahogany, its surface still holding an ink bottle, a pen tray, and a blotter turned the color of weak tea. There was a shelf along the back wall, and on it a row of cloth-bound journals. She counted 11 of them, a sextant in a mahogany case, a good hatchet, a tin of matches sealed with wax, and a hurricane lamp, its chimney unbroken, still a quarter full of oil that had gone thick as honey. The mundane and the marvelous, shelved side by side like brothers. She lit the lamp, and the flame took, after 39 years, on the 3rd match. In the lamplight she opened the first strongbox. The straps were sound, the lid lifted on oiled hinges. Inside, in canvas bags stenciled with the Denver mint mark, in rows fitted as carefully as the cedar wall had been fitted, was gold. Double eagles, mostly, $20 pieces, and eagles, and a lower tier of silver dollars in paper-wrapped rolls. She did not count it that night, she could not have, her hands were not steady enough, but later, in the presence of the bank and 2 witnesses, the count came to $14,850. More money than the Pellin yard had paid out in wages in the last 3 years combined. In the second strongbox there was no money at all. There was a folded wool coat, a man's, gone thin at the elbows. There was a framed photograph, face down, of a woman in a high collar holding a little girl of perhaps 4. And there was a small thing wrapped in flannel, no bigger than a peach, and when Nell unwrapped it she found herself holding a carved wooden bird, a swallow, she thought, though she was no naturalist, carved from some pale wood with a penknife, its wings half spread, every feather suggested with 3 quick cuts, the work of a man with good hands and long empty evenings. The carving was worn smooth on one side, where a thumb had rubbed it, over and over, across years. And on the field desk, squared to the blotter's edge, weighted with a brass inkwell, was an envelope. The paper had gone ivory with age but the ink had not faded, and the hand that wrote it had been a clerk's hand, fine and exact. It said, "To whoever finds this." Nell sat down on the floor of the hidden room, in the lamplight, with 39 years of dust on her father's coat, and opened it. The letter filled 4 pages. I am going to give it to you whole, the way she read it, because some things should not be shortened. To whoever finds this. My name is Elias Crow. I was paymaster of the Pellin and Western Railroad, and if you have found this room, then I have been dead some while, and what the company said of me has stood all these years unchallenged. They will have told you I stole the June payroll of 1872, 11 men's months of wages, mine to guard, gone with me into the dark. I did not steal it. I saved it, and the difference matters, and since you are reading this, you are the first person in the world who knows it. On the 3rd of June, 1872, I carried the payroll from Denver by special car, this car, as I had done every month for 6 years. My partner in the arrangement, the man who owned the consignment and the siding and, I learned too late, a great deal of paper besides, was a man named Hollis Vane. Vane had debts I did not know about. His plan was simple, the payroll would vanish between Denver and Pellin, the blame would fall on the paymaster, for who doubts a ledger? And we would divide the money when the dust settled. When I understood what he intended, on the night before the run, I had one choice left. I could not go to the law. Vane owned half the law in that county. So I took the money off the manifest's path. I had this compartment built years before, against exactly such a day, God forgive my foresight. I sealed the money in it, sealed the car, and consigned it to the Pellin yard, meaning to come for it when I had proof enough to hang Vane instead. I never got the proof. I was shot on the road outside Colorado Springs on the 9th of June, 1872, by a man Vane hired for $40. I know this because the man told me so while I lay dying, a strange courtesy, but the dying get few of those, and I took it. I did not die, not then. I lived 3 more months, in hiding, under another name, too broke and too watched to move. My wife, Anne, had died the winter before. My daughter, Ruth, was 4 years old and living with my sister in St. Louis, and the last letter I ever posted to her said that Papa would come by Christmas with a carved bird for her tree. The bird is on the shelf in the second box. I finished it the week I was shot. I never posted it. I could not risk the mail. So here is the truth, and here is the bequest, and I make it to you, whoever you are, because you are the person who looked at what the whole world called worthless and took the time to find otherwise. The money in the first box is not mine and never was. It is the wages of 11 men, June 1872, with 39 years, or however long it has been, of my shame as interest. Their names are in the first journal, on the flyleaf. If any of them yet live, or their widows or children do, pay them. See, the men are paid. That is the first charge on this money, and I ask it of you as one working soul to another. What remains after that is yours, and I give it freely, with only this instruction: do not let it make you into a man like Vane, who counted everything and valued nothing. Use it well. Make something live again. The carved bird is not part of the bequest of money, but I find I cannot leave it without an owner. If you have read this far, you have a patient heart. Keep the bird, and when you think of it, say a word for Ruth Crowe, who would be a woman grown now, and who was told her father was a thief. Elias Crowe, Paymaster. Written this 12th of September, 1872. Nell read the letter 3 times in the lamplight. The lamp flame leaned in the draught from the door, and outside, across the yard, she could hear the evening freight building its air, and the ordinary clank and call of men working, unaware that 34 feet away, 39 years had just come to an end. She did not cry. But she sat there a long time, with the carved swallow in one hand and her father's hammer, which she had carried in without noticing, in the other, and she thought about a man who had spent his last 3 months on earth carving a bird he could not post. What would you do with $14,850 that wasn't yours? Really, think about it. Tell me in the comments. Because what Nell did next is the whole reason this story is worth telling. She did not leave Pellin. Every sensible voice in the world, and she could hear them all, Purvis, the yardmen, Silas Brandt, told her what a girl of 19 with no one watching owed to a list of dead men, nothing. She had 11 men to find across 39 years, and no one would ever have known if she'd found 0. She found all 11. It took her the rest of that year, and it took her in the open, because Nell Hadley understood something her father had taught her without ever saying it, that quiet work, done in the open, is the only argument that cannot be answered. She took the letter and the journals to the bank in Pellin, not to Hollis Vane's bank, for Hollis Vane was dead 12 years, but to his son, Colter Vane, who owned the bank, the grain elevator, the coal dock, and, as it happened, the very piece of ground her siding rail sat on. And here the story turns, so lean in. Colter Vane had tried to buy car 412 from her in June, 2 weeks after the auction. He'd sent Purvis, of all people, with an offer of $20, this for a car the scrappers had valued at $2. Nell had declined, and she'd wondered about it at the time, the way you wonder about a cold draft in a closed room. Now, reading the journals, she understood. Elias Crowe wrote plainly in the 3rd journal that Hollis Vane knew the payroll was in that car. He'd never found the compartment. A banker does not think to strike a wall and listen, but he knew the money had never left the car, and he'd spent the rest of his life, apparently, making sure the car never left the yard, and he'd passed that fixation down to his son like a watch or a debt. $20. For a coffin on wheels. The offer had never been for the car. It had been for whatever the car was remembering. Rust is just iron remembering, Orrin Pike had said. And that car's been remembering something heavy, so Nell did not go to Colter Vane alone, and she did not go quietly, and she did not go to accuse him. She understood, with a 19-year-old's rare precision, that a son is not his father's crime. She went with the letter, and the journals, and Orrin Pike, who had been yard watchman in 1872 and remembered the night car 412 came in, and the editor of the Pellin paper, a hungry young man named Fisk who could smell a front page the way a dog smells weather. She laid it all on the bank's mahogany counter as a matter of public record. She made no accusation. She simply read the letter aloud, in the bank, at noon, on a Thursday, in front of 30 witnesses. A ledger, her uncle Silas believed, never lies. Nell had learned different from her father, but she had also learned this: a ledger may lie. But a dead man's handwriting, in a room sealed for 39 years, does not. The reckoning, when it came, was almost silent, and that is how you will know it was real. There was no showdown, no pistol, no shouting in the street. Colter Vane read the letter twice, standing behind his own counter, and whatever he found in his face to do with it, he did it alone, after hours. What happened publicly was only this: the Pellin Gazette ran the story on page 1 under the headline Paymaster's Letter, and it ran the 11 names from the journal's flyleaf, and it ran the full text of Elias Crow's bequest. Within a month, the story had been reprinted in Denver, and then in St. Louis, and that is how the world learned, 39 years late, that the paymaster had not been a thief, and whose money had built the Vane fortune. No court ever sat on it. None needed to. Men stopped taking their grain to the Vane elevator. They drove 12 miles to the siding at Loomis instead. 2 of the bank's depositors, the mine office and the church, moved their accounts to the new branch Nell had, by then, caused to be opened. Colter Vane did not fall. He did something quieter and more total: he became irrelevant. Within 2 years the bank had thinned to 1 room and 1 clerk, and no one in Pellin could have told you when exactly he left town, only that one spring his house stood empty, the way a sealed thing does before someone patient comes along. And Silas Brandt. Silas read the story in the Cheyenne paper, the part where his niece, the diminishing asset, the $11 disbursement, had found $14,850 in the salvage he'd been too cheap to claim. He wrote her one letter. It was a clerk's letter. It noted, in fine exact handwriting, that as her nearest male relative and former guardian he had a claim of sorts, a moral claim, on her estate, and he used the word settlement twice. Nell read it once, at the rooming house table, and folded it, and put it in the stove, and answered it the way her father answered flawed iron, with silence. She never heard from him again. Some accounts close themselves. But the 11 men. The 11 men are the heart of it, and Nell treated the finding of them the way her father treated a long forging: no hurry, no skipped heats. 3 of the men were still alive. The oldest, a track walker named Benavides, was 74 and living with his daughter in Trinidad, and when Nell arrived with his June wages from 1872, $104, plus the interest she had calculated herself, at savings bank rates, across 39 years, he sat down on his porch and took off his hat and held it in his hands like a bowl. 4 of the men had died, but had widows or children, and Nell found them all, one as far as Omaha, one in a miner's hospital in Telluride. The last 4 had left no one at all that 39 years could find, and for those 4, Nell did the only thing left. She paid their wages, with interest, into a fund, and she set that fund to the purpose Crow's letter had given her. She made something live again. She bought the roundhouse. The Pellin and Weston had closed it in 1907 when the division point moved to Loomis, and it had stood 4 years cold, the forge dead, the great table rusted solid, pigeons in the rafters. Nell bought it, and the coal dock, and the 30 feet of siding under car 412, for $3,100, and she reopened it as the Hadley Ironworks, repair work, forge work, tool work, the kind of shop a railroad town bleeds without. And here is where the town's arithmetic changed, the way it changes in real life, not with speeches, but with payrolls. She hired 6 men in the first month. Amos Bly, the coffin carpenter who had squared her tool shed post without a word, built her new shop doors and sent his son to apprentice. Cora Penn's bread stopped appearing on the crosstie, because it started appearing on the shop's lunch table instead, on her own invoice, at a fair price, which was the only term she'd accept. Gus Halden, the old roundhouse machinist, came out of a sour retirement to run the lathe. He'd offered his labor back in June, shyly, for nothing but a look inside the famous car, and she'd hired him instead, which he told everyone was the better deal. Orrin Pike, 81 years old, was given the watchman's chair and lamp again, this time for wages, and he sat by the door of the Hadley Ironworks until he died 3 years later, and it was said he died content, though Nell never once heard him say so. She paid the town back its opinion of her in the only currency a working town respects: competence, repeated daily, in the open, with the forge door wide. Now, step forward with me about a year to the autumn of 1912 and let me show you what the story looks like when it's finished. The roundhouse at Pellin runs hot 6 days a week. The forge fire goes up at 5 in the morning, and the first thing made in it every day is not a tool or a part, it is coffee, in a blackened pot set in the coals, a ritual Nell keeps because her father kept it, and the men know the pot is poured at 6 sharp and that a mug for them costs nothing but being there. Car 412 still stands on its 30 feet of rail out back, but the weeds are gone, and the wood is painted now a deep, honest red, and it serves as the shop's strong room and office, its false wall hinged and brass-fitted, its old door hung on new straps that swing free because Nell oils them herself every Saturday, without fail, the way some people tend a grave. Which, in a manner of speaking, it is. The men are paid on the first Saturday of the month, in cash, in envelopes, from the paymaster's field desk of Elias Crow, which Nell uses for the purpose it was built for, because she finds she likes the symmetry. On the desk, beside the blotter, sits a carved wooden swallow, wings half spread. The men have all heard the story, the whole county has, and new apprentices are told, by older men, with great solemnity, that they may look at the bird but not touch it, and that the boss can tell a flawed bar by its ring, and that neither of these facts is to be tested. And Ruth Crow? The letter in the St. Louis paper did its slow work. It took 2 years, but in the spring of 1913 a letter came to the Hadley Iron Works in a woman's careful hand, from a Mrs. Ruth Calloway, 45 years old, a schoolteacher, who had been told all her life that her father had died a thief. And who had read, 39 years late, that he had died instead a man who spent his last free week carving her a bird. Nell sent her the swallow. Some of you will think she should have kept it. Nell thought about it a long time, and then thought about whose name was on the letter's last line, and the decision, she said afterward, was not hard once she asked the right question, not what was the bird worth, but whose was it. Ruth came to Pellin that summer, on the train, and stood in car 412, and cried, which Nell never had, and the two of them took coffee on the car steps at 6 in the morning for a week, and remained friends the rest of their lives. But that is another story. And so we come to the last scene, and it is an evening scene, because that is when these things end. It is dusk in October, 1912, and the forge is banked for the night, and Nell Hadley is sitting on the steps of car 412 with the last of the light coming red over the divide. In her left hand is her father's hammer, 11 inches of hickory, a pound and a quarter of good steel, NH stamped in the cheek, worn bright where her hand and his hand have held the same wood. In her right hand, for this one evening, is the carved swallow. Ruth sent it back to be photographed for the Denver paper, and it must be posted home in the morning. She holds them side by side in her lap, these two small things, and thinks about the two men who made them. One man gave her the skill, the hammer, the eye, the rule that iron tells the truth if you strike it gentle. The other man gave her the test, a sealed car, a dead note in the wall, and a letter that asked whether she'd use a windfall to run or to repair. Between the hammer and the bird, she thinks, there is the whole of her life, and not $1 of it measures right in a ledger. She was 19 years old. She had been put out of her uncle's house with $11 to her name, counted in a column of 3 and a column of 3 on a clerk's blotter. 6 of those dollars had bought a coffin on wheels that no one could open. 39 years it had waited. $14,850 it had held. 11 men it had owed. And one girl, with a hammer and her father's voice in her ear, had been the one person patient enough to strike it gentle and listen for the ring. The lamp comes on in the roundhouse behind her. Tomorrow the forge goes up at 5. The bird goes in the mail. The men get paid on Saturday. The work continues. Thank you for staying with us for this story of patience and worth. If Nell's journey moved you, the hammer, the bird, the wall that wouldn't sing, please give this video a like, and share it with someone who taught you a skill, or someone who needs reminding that the world is often wrong about what things are worth. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, so you won't miss our next tale. Next week, a lighthouse keeper's daughter inherits a light that's been dark for 50 years, and finds out why it was really extinguished. Until then, be well. And tell me in the comments before you go, what is the worthless thing in your life that turned out to be the treasure, and who taught you how to see it? The lamp is lit. The work continues. Good night.